So before I get started, maybe a little bit of background about the World Resources Institute. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan environmental think tank. We have offices in Washington, D.C., China, Brazil, India. I think I'm missing a few countries. But we have 450 people worldwide working on issues at the intersection of humans and the environment. And so maybe just before I get into my presentation, to reflect on a few themes that have come up already. So we do have an office in China. We have a website that I encourage those of you that are interested in China issues to go to, China Facts, to go visit. Because one of the things that has been striking to us is that there is actually much more going on there than I think is commonly assumed. Apart from the fact that they have intensity reduction targets to reduce the amounts of greenhouse gases that they're emitting by 2020 by 40 to 45%. They also, last year, developed more wind and other renewable energy than the United States did. The air pollution issue is a very critical issue for the country, and there are some people, some analysts who think that as the country starts to tackle that more seriously, that we may start to see coal peak in China much sooner than is otherwise expected. So there are some really interesting trends there, and it's not just simply a matter of looking at the graph and pointing up. So again, I encourage you to go visit China Facts. The other thing I want to mention on the monitoring and verification, one of the other things we do when we have an institute of our size is we have lots of exciting projects that sometimes are relevant in these conversations, but we have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is an organization that's really tasked at trying to figure out monitoring and verification measurements that work for countries, for states, and works for individual businesses. I guess the short answer is, to my perspective from the earlier question, is we know how to do this. Depending upon the scale, depending upon the place that we're measuring, we can do this quite accurately for most things. The exception, though there are some real tough exceptions, like natural gas systems where you have methane venting from different parts of the system. But otherwise, there are some good mechanisms. So again, another resource for those of you that are really interested in monitoring and verification, I would encourage you to look at. So on to the point that I'm actually here for, is to talk a little bit about the international context, the framework and negotiations, but as well to dive a little bit more into what's happening on the ground in the U.S. The U.S., world's second largest emitter, so what's happening there obviously matters. One of the things that hopefully you'll walk away thinking is that, in fact, there's more happening than is commonly assumed, and that there's reason to believe that the next steps for the country are much cheaper than you would otherwise assume. And in fact, we think that this is not a unique circumstance. And this is why we launched a new initiative called the New Climate Economy, which I'll talk about later, which intends to evaluate those opportunities at a global scale and to see what that really looks like, to see whether there's a way to get where we really need to be. So, the Coalition of the Parties meeting in Paris next year, end of next year, November, December. That's where the world's leaders are going to be asked to commit to a framework to reduce their emissions post-2020. Success there is fundamentally going to require that the countries deliver on their 2020 commitments that they committed to in Cancun. And I also think the piece that's going to help really drive success there is what the experiences those countries have had to date in meeting those targets. What types of costs have they endured? Have they realized real benefits, as we think that they can, for certain types of policies? And what do they project the future is going to look like? Now, as you have already heard, the U.S., few countries are more important than the U.S. If the U.S. does not meet its 17% target in 2020, then it's going to be very difficult to see the rest of the world's leaders implement something that's truly ambitious. So what happens matters. Now, the common assumption previously had been that if you can't get the Congress together, then the U.S. is sunk. There's no other way to do this. We did analysis last year, a report called Can the U.S. Get There From Here, where we actually went around all the sectors in the economy, surveyed to see what the authorities were, what technical experts thought you could achieve. And what we found is that, in fact, past Congresses had given the administration the tools by using the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, the FAA, and other agencies to really make significant strides and to hit that target if they pursue those opportunities with sufficient levels of ambition. If, on the other hand, nothing is done, then the story was actually pretty clear. U.S. emissions were going to rise, and we were going to end up very far from that target. The interesting thing that we found as well is that really in the end, you've got to just focus on 4 major things in the near term for the U.S. If the U.S. does this right, 17% is within reach. That's reduce emissions at existing power plants. It's reduce the rapidly increasing emissions of hydrofluorocarbons, which are commonly used as refrigerants. Reduce fugitive methane emissions from natural gas systems. So the wasted product that you end up venting into the atmosphere at varying stages, from the wellhead to the production and processing systems for natural gas. And then to improve energy efficiency throughout the U.S. economy. You do those 4 things, you can get there. And we were therefore very encouraged when, a few months later, the president came out with his climate action plan that called for many of these same things to happen in the near term. And as we think about what the future holds for those measures, when we think about how those policies and programs are going to be implemented, I think it's worth reflecting on recent history, because I think that is a very reasonable gauge of what the future will look like. And what I mean there is the vehicle standards that were finalized just about 2 years ago now. If you look at them, they're quite ambitious. They're going to double fuel economy of vehicles roughly by 2025, reducing by 1/2 the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that come out of every car and truck. The exciting thing about these regulations is, though, that as a result of people traveling to the pump fewer times, refueling less, over the life of the vehicles, these regulations are expected to save people $5,700 to $7,400 per vehicle. So regulations getting deep reductions while also yielding significant savings to consumers. So I think that's the same format. This is the recipe for what we're going to see that comes next. And the next big piece is power plants. These are their standards for existing rules for existing power plants that they have announced will come out from EPA this June. Now, these standards have potential to deliver considerable benefits to consumers in 3 basic ways. First, by taking advantage of the changing dynamics of fuel prices. 2, by leveraging state programs for energy efficiency, which have been yielding benefits and savings to customers on the order of magnitude of $2 to $5 for every dollar invested. And 3, by reducing emissions of harmful air pollution that still comes from the nation's fleet of older plants, reducing emissions of SO2, NOx, mercury, etc. So power plant rules are really important, ultimately. Power sector accounts for about 1/3 of U.S. emissions. And our analysis suggests that they can reduce their emissions by nearly 1/3 by 2020 and get much deeper reductions in the years that follow. I think the timing matters a lot. So you can see from this graph that the nation has a lot of old power plants, more than 50, 60 years old, the columns on the left. And many of those plants are ones without NOx or SO2 controls for basic air pollution. Those plants now have an important decision to make about whether or not to install new mercury controls in advance of those standards going into effect. And the key decision that those plant operators must make is, do they reinvest in this old infrastructure, or do they begin transitioning to new types of generation, taking advantage of some of the new trends in generation? And this is where I think some of the specific examples that we've been seeing at the state level are really interesting. So the Michigan Public Service Commission just recently found that, in fact, it is cheaper for them to buy new wind power than it is for them to buy and build new coal plants. They're not alone. Texas, as a result of the low price of wind, is building transmission lines that are expected to lead to the development of 7,500 megawatts of new wind over the next 3 years and could unlock, I think it's 16,000 megawatts of new wind. Now that's roughly 25% of their current peak demand today. That's a lot of wind. But it's not just wind that we're talking about here. Solar prices have been falling quite dramatically as well. And now Austin Energy, just maybe I think last month, contracted for 150 megawatts of new solar that's come in at half the price of what they could get new coal power at. Half the price. So the question is, are these outliers? Is something else going on here? Or is this a sign that we're starting to hit some tipping points here in the US? And I guess I would suggest that if you look again at the recent past, you might conclude that we're starting to hit this tipping point. Before greenhouse gas regulations have even come into play at the national level, we've seen a dramatic shift in the type of generation that's been built in this country. Since 1990, we've seen very little coal generation. We've seen, on the basic economics of gas, you see in red, lots of gas coming into the market, lots of renewables in purple coming in particular since 2000. Since 2000, new coal plants have accounted for less than 6% of new generation. So to us, that suggests maybe we are at this tipping point. So that's very relevant when we think about these new power plant standards and what they're going to mean. And one of the things that's important to us as we think about them is that the states are going to play a really big role in the ultimate implementation of these standards. The states, ultimately what EPA will do is they'll set guidelines that determine the level of reductions, the timelines, but it's up to states to figure out what are their unique opportunities, what's best for their ratepayers, how do they get from where they are to where they need to be in a meaningful way. And so they're going to be able to build off of all of these programs that you already heard about, the renewable portfolio standards that they have in place that are already reducing emissions by avoiding the need for fossil-based generation. They'll be able to build off of their energy efficiency standards, which 20 states already have, which again yield about $2 to $5 of direct savings to customers for every dollar invested. And those states that have cap and trade will be able to leverage those programs as well. And one of the things that I think is interesting is where you see the intersection of those types of programs, because this is, I think, the type of model that can be very successful. There's multiple ways to do this, but the RGGI example, I think, is a really interesting one. So again, cap and trade program for CO2 emissions from large power plants in the Northeast. What they've done is they've really committed themselves to pairing the reduction in emissions from the power sector to a heavy investment in energy efficiency. And as a result of that process, as a result of their intelligent program design, they've been able to realize $1.6 billion in growth, 16,000 net jobs, all while during a recession during the first 3 years of its program, 2009 through 2011. And this comes as a result of $1.3 billion in savings to consumers and helping to keep money local by reducing the amount that they're paying to ship fossil fuels into the region. But I think those regions are not alone. Those states are not unique, actually, in many regards in what they're capable of. And so one of the things that we've been doing over the last couple months is actually surveying the landscape of other states to see how representative are these types of opportunities. And we've done a series of analyses for Ohio, North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Colorado, Wisconsin, Minnesota. And they all parallel what you see here for Ohio, which is that there are lots of opportunities to reduce emissions, get deep reductions, this lowest mark here, the black line, by leveraging the existing programs they have in place, by building on them, in some cases extending them, and by utilizing the infrastructure they have in place, utilizing a lot of the gas infrastructure, gas plants that are currently, in some places, still underutilized in many regards. So ultimately, the U.S. is just one of the countries that's weighing these options, that is trying to figure out how do you get real reductions in a way that makes sense. And hopefully what I think I've convinced you of is that in the U.S. anyway, there are opportunities, or appear to be opportunities, to get these deep reductions from the power sector. And other sectors as well, while potentially producing net benefits to consumers as a result of reduced fuel consumption, as a result of shifting price dynamics that we see playing out before us now, and finally as a result of reduced air pollution that comes from some of these types of policies. And so to succeed, though, ultimately, we're going to need lots of countries to figure out that same calculus, to figure out what makes sense for them, because we're going to need a lot of different players to put their best foot forward if we're really going to solve this problem. And so ultimately, these questions are economic questions that are at their very heart, right? And so one of the things that we've done recently is we've convened this new project that we call the New Climate Economy to provide an unbiased assessment of the true costs and benefits of mitigation. This is a project that we've done at the request of 7 commissioning countries in Norway, the UK, South Korea, Indonesia, Sweden, Colombia, and Ethiopia. This work is being overseen by an international council of former heads of state, including Stoltenberg, including finance ministers, leaders in the field of economics, business, finance, and being chaired by President Felipe Calderon from Mexico. Now, this work is not just being done by us. WRI, we're serving as the managing partner for this project, but it's pulling off of research institutes from around the world. We have Tsinghua University in China, we have ICRIER in India, we have EDRI in Ethiopia, we have the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio in Brazil. We also have Stockholm Environment Institute in Europe. We have the the Climate Policy Initiative and others all participating in this. So this is very exciting to us. It's also being overseen in order to really hold our feet to the fire. We've actually convened an economic panel being chaired by Lord Nicholas Stern, and that includes 2 former Nobel Prize winners, including Daniel Kahneman and Michael Spence. So please do look for this work. We're going to be reporting out our findings on the cost, the real costs and benefits of mitigation this September, leading up to the UN General Assembly meetings. In the meantime, please do track our progress at www.newclimateeconomy.net. Thank you.